Super. All right. Welcome everyone to the Individual Reality Understanding Unique TBI presentations. You are participating in Brain Northwest's programming and I'm just delighted to have you here today. My name is Reggie Costanzo. I am the Education and Resource Manager here and your co-learner. And we have the privilege today of having another class from our lovely Katarina Turner. Katarina has extensive work experience and personal experience related to the TBI community, brain injury community, veteran community. She's supported a lot of different clients over the years who have experienced a TBI, along with taking a new position, which is exciting in a veteran service organization in her hometown. So I'm really grateful that she's still able to make time for us because her contributions are really important and valuable. So thank you again for being here and for all of your commitment to serving this community, Katarina. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for your always so warm and kind introduction, Reggie. Everyone, I am Katarina Turner, and I am so excited to be here with you today. I've been doing these classes for about half a year now, but seeing these familiar faces, come back and return, and it makes my heart so full. So I'm so happy to be here. Now, before we dive in, I just want to acknowledge who is in this room. When I was creating this slide deck, I did want to keep it more so as community support in mind too. So, if you may be here because you support someone living with a brain injury or you have a brain injury yourself, whoever you are, whatever brought you here, you absolutely belong in this conversation and your presence is appreciated. Now, what we're going to explore together today is not meant to be in a clinical lens. You will see some clinical verbiage. I'm not a medical professional by any means. Again, my history kind of leans a little bit into that, but for the most part, it will be through a community lens to shift really how we think about brain injury and the people navigating life with one. So I'd like to just start with one
Sorry,
question
one
that I
second. Could I get your name and the other gal's name? Spent so much time trying to get my picture up there that I missed your names.
Yes,
Nope,
ma'am.
no problem. Go ahead, Katarina.
I am Katarina Turner, and I have a background in case management, and I'm your facilitator today.
And my
Reggie?
name is Reggie Costanzo, and I am the Education and Resource Manager here at Brain Northwest.
Okay, thank you.
You bet.
Yes, ma'am. So, the one question that I would like you to kind of hold in your mind throughout our time together would be what would change if we stopped seeing a diagnosis and we started seeing a person? I know that sounds a little fluffy and a little woo-woo, when you really think about it, like, oh, that sounds a little cliche. But that question is really going to be at the heartbeat of everything that we discuss. Now, I don't have to tell any of you, TBI is a life-altering event. And I just want to sit with that statement for just a moment because we can say those words. Like I just said, we can read them on the slide. I can read them on a slide. I do not have a brain injury. So I can't really speak to that and I can't imagine what it is to have one. But I think that sometimes we move too quickly past the gravity of what that actually means.
Mhm.
A brain injury doesn't just affect one thing, like a broken bone affects walking. It ripples through every domain of a person's existence. It changes your identity, the very core of who someone understands themselves to be. It
Mhm.
can change relationships, kind of altering the dance and the connection of the people that we love. It can change your work life, your sense of self, of contribution, and sometimes it can really shake that sense of meaning in life.
Mhm.
So, you know, imagine you're in the middle of a sentence, which I imagine you don't have to imagine at all sometimes if you struggle with memory issues or, word finding, you get exhausted by a 5-minute conversation that never tired you before, and a fatigue feels like wading through cement. The people around you look the same, but the world looks very different to you. And when you try to explain the profound internal shift, people look at you and may say, you're fine. It's been forever. Just kind of pick it up, move on, and keep on trucking along. But for those of you in this room who have lived through this and been told that you look fine, please just know you are validated and you are what this conversation is going to be about here today.
Mhm.
So I'd like to just zoom out a little bit and look at the macro scale and the scope. Globally, somewhere between, let's see, 64 to 74 million
Mhm.
traumatic brain injuries occur every single year. And that is
Right.
not a small subgroup. That isn't a niche issue, and it's,
Mhm.
definitely a public health reality of massive proportions. And here in the United States, about 18.2% of adults report having experienced
Mhm.
TBI with loss of consciousness at some point in their lives. That's like what? I'm no mathematician, like 1 in 5 people. Someone can
Mhm.
absolutely message me later on those facts. But really think about, your neighborhood, your workplace, your family gatherings. Several of those people
Mhm.
have experienced brain injury, and everyone is different. But the gap that
Mhm.
really concerns me and what keeps me up at night is most community providers and social workers. I won't say social workers because they're pretty well versed. Looking at you, Reggie. So case managers and educators receive minimal TBI specific training.
Mhm.
The very people that individuals with brain injury turn to for help often, they don't really have that specialized map that they need to navigate the TBI terrain. And
Mhm.
this gap can also lead to tragic outcomes that can include misunderstanding, misdiagnosis, and missed opportunities to help when it matters most. So here we have the web of variability of why no two TBIs are alike. So why do I keep emphasizing individualization? Why can't there be a standard protocol or a checklist that works for everyone with a brain injury? Because I'm sure you've heard it before, and I'm going to say it a million times, no two brain injuries are alike. And when you look at this web, every single factor you see here influences how a brain injury presents and how someone experiences recovery. Before the brain injury, there were pre-injury factors. And this is something that a lot of
Mhm.
people don't really take into account. How old was the person? Was it a kiddo with a developing brain, which is still wiring itself? It's definitely going to respond differently, say, to a 60-year-old's brain who perhaps maybe experienced a stroke. So, what pre existing
Mhm.
conditions were present? If someone had a history of, say, anxiety or depression, the TBI may turn that volume on that anxiety or depression maybe from a 3 to about a 10 and
Mhm.
exacerbate that condition. So, what was their cognitive reserve, which is just their education level, their lifestyle habits, their genetics? All of these really set the stage. Then there's the brain injury itself, which is the mechanism. What was it, a pressure wave? Was it, like I mentioned earlier, was it a stroke? Was it
Mhm.
impact of a fall, blow to the head? So each creates different patterns of damage, and the location absolutely matters. So, say a frontal lobe injury affecting what I like to call the brain CEO looks completely different than a temporal lobe injury affecting memory. Were there secondary injuries like hypoxia, oxygen deprivation, or swelling that cause additional damage hours after the event? So, all of these kind of different events, they're all just so unique to the individual and they all impact you in a different way. Also, severity labels like mild, moderate, severe, it's based on the initial presentation, say in the ER, and it's absolutely not the long-term outcome. And I'll come back to that later because it's very important, and I will absolutely harp on, mild, moderate, severe, and what that means, or what that looks like or presents to other people when they do hear that. So, also thinking about the time since injury, access to care, the quality of support, thinking about the resources that are around them, the environment, the psychological response. All of these are interwoven together, so you are extremely unique. And that is why no cookie cutter approaches work. And that's why seeing the individual matters so much. Okay, so I promised that we were going to return back to the severity label. And this is so important because I believe that words have power. They have power when we hear them. They come with different, connotations that people will hear, and it's kind of like the stigma associated with the word in and of itself. So 80 to 90% of all TBI is classified as mild. And yet, and I really want everyone to hear this, there is nothing mild about living with a mild traumatic brain injury. The label describes the initial presentation. How long was the person unconscious? How confused were they in the emergency room? That's what mild refers to. It says absolutely nothing about what life looks like 6 months or 6 years later. And there could be some harm just to the label. It kind of creates this cognitive dissonance, and it can lead to perhaps providers and even family members to unconsciously minimize symptoms. And when someone says, I have a mild TBI, and then describes debilitating fatigue or memory problems or difficulty keeping a job, there's a disconnect. The word mild creates an expectation of quick recovery, or, it doesn't really match the gritty reality that you may have. And then there's the invisibility challenge, which I believe that's the biggest thing about TBI is there's no cast, there's no wheelchair unless, God forbid your TBI was so severe to where you were in a situation to where it is visible. But the person looks completely normal. And so they hear you look fine over and over again, and it can absolutely feel like gaslighting. Cognitive fatigue is one of the most common experiences, and it's completely invisible. Good days can get mistaken for a cure. You were fine the other day, like you were good for a solid month. You were doing really well at your job, and now like everything is up in flames. Like, what's the issue? This is a you problem. So that's something that you may have experienced, but it ebbs and it flows. The Center TBI research from 2024 confirms that, so many people living with this already know. Even patients with normal CT imaging may experience persistent symptoms for months to years after a mild TBI. So when someone shares their experience, believe them. And if this is you, and if, this kind of echoes through your experience, don't feel the need to kind of validate your experience or explain your experience. Just know that it's absolutely valid and you don't owe anyone an explanation. And this brings me to what I consider a guiding principle. The person living with a brain injury is absolutely an expert in your own experience. They don't know what it's like to live inside your brain as a community support provider, or in your body, it's your life. They don't know what works and what doesn't. They don't know your values or your priorities or your fears. So I believe that the best outcome happens when they overlap, where an individual's professional expertise and your lived experience come together. Not where someone prescribes and then another complies, or you're complicit, or maybe you might feel a little bit intimidated to speak up for yourself or advocate for yourself with your providers. So really just keep in mind that, you're both partners in figuring it out together and figuring out what works best for you. I believe that person-centered goals improve treatment adherence. I don't like that word. I'm gonna redact that word. I believe person-centered goals improve treatment and quality of life and just overall satisfaction and engagement. So in your next interaction, if you're supporting someone or if you're advocating for yourself, how can we move from expertise being given to someone versus expertise being shared with someone? And here are some mental traps. So mental traps absolutely get in the way of good support. Even with the best intentions, we all carry assumptions that can hurt, whether we're professionals, family members, or even judging ourselves or the quiet words that we tell ourselves. I call the first one the timeline trap. And it sounds like this, like what I had said previously, they should be better. Recovery follows a predictable timeline. And I've heard this personally with a loved one. You should be better. You shouldn't be experiencing any of these symptoms at all. You should be completely fine. So whatever it is that you're experiencing, it has to be something else. This is not related. Recovery is nonlinear. It is messy. Plateaus are not permanent endpoints. When we fall into this trap, services get discontinued too early. People get blamed for the lack of progress when really progress doesn't look the way we expected. The second trap is the motivation trap. Oh, if they really wanted to, they would. They talk about it all day long, but they never follow through because that's what looks like poor motivation, but it's often just a neurological symptom. I once worked with an individual, and we're going to call him Marcus. Before his injury, Marcus worked at a logistics warehouse. He was motivated, he was engaged. He was the guy who solved all the problems before anyone knew existed. And this is what he disclosed to me as I used to be the person that knew all the answers. I was able to I was a trucker, like I trucked through life, like I never had any issue with motivation. But after his injury, his family was frustrated because, he'd say that he'd want to do things. He wanted to go back to work, and he felt that he couldn't do the work and that he couldn't be the person that he was before. So he just didn't go. He was motivated to do it, but the follow through wasn't there. And, his family would give him a really hard time about it, which created other, anxiety and depression and shame. So when we blame the person, we create shame and we create withdrawal. And then, of course, ends up damaging the very relationships that could help. So deconstructing the lazy myth, the reality of atonемia, which is really just a fancy word for, again, wanting to have that energy, but it's just like this overwhelming kind of slump of, I just don't have it in me. And it's not just being tired, it's just feeling defeated for the day, or as long as it affects you, just having zero energy. So I did want to go a little bit deeper on this because it's pretty misunderstood. And for those of you who have experienced it, understanding the neurology can be incredibly validating. And I am all about validating. So like I have here, the old way of thinking is seeing someone who's unmotivated or non-compliant, which I've seen in various case notes, not being compliant or being depressed, or they say they want to do things, but they never follow through. It must be them, like it's just a them issue. So the new and neuro-informed way that I would like for individuals, and you can even advocate for this for yourself, is, like I said, it's atonemia. And really, it's just a clinical term for when the brain start button stops working properly. And I like to explain it thinking about a car sitting in a driveway, and the vehicle has a full tank of gas, which is your motivation and your wanting, but the starter motor is dead. You can sit in the driver's seat all day long. You're wanting to drive, you're wanting to take it for a spin. You even get frustrated with yourself. But if that spark doesn't fire, if that starter motor is broken, you're not going to go anywhere. And it's not because you don't want to. Neurologically, we're kind of talking about your circuits, so the pathways that connect intention to action. These circuits rely on dopamine signaling, and when they're damaged, that kind of internal go signal goes silent. So now that we kind of go through all the clinical stuff, which, like I said, I'm not clinical at all. So I'm about resolution and okay, like this sounds terrible. Like we know all of this. What can we do about it? So something that helped previously with a lot of the clients I served was something called body doubling. And this is something that I talk about often. And it's just when another person's physical presence serves as an external starter motor. So it's not supervision or nagging or hovering or kind of keeping on you about something. It's about that co-regulation. So when you're near someone whose system is running smoothly, your brain can just borrow that momentum to get started. And another tool that I really like is the 10-second rule, because processing can be delayed when asking a question or making a request. You can wait. You can count to 10 internally. I know it feels really awkward, but often around the second 8, that starter motor finally catches. So if you're like, okay, oh, gosh, I know I need to take a shower. I really don't feel like taking a shower today. I'm tired. I'm feeling down. Just kind of give yourself that 10 seconds and try to get your motor running. And that way you can really be intentional about, okay, here's the set time and this is when it's going to happen. So now I'd like to briefly touch on something because I cannot speak to different presentations without at least mentioning younger kiddos and how that may impact you, and especially if your TBI was sustained when you were younger. So when a child has a brain injury, their brains are still under construction. They're still developing, and the thing about developing brains is, early injury may not show up until years later when the demands of life increase. So there was a kiddo who was struck by a baseball. They were at a baseball game, took a full-blown baseball to their brain. They were 3 years old. They seemed to recover. Parents were relieved. Doctors said everything looks good. For years, everything seemed fine because the demands on the kiddo are relatively low. But then later on in life, when middle school hit, suddenly, they had a lot of homework, a lot of social conflicts, and that disorganization kind of seemed to come out of nowhere. They were like, gosh, this feels like a different person. I don't know where that switch came on. They were perfectly normal. They were content. They were good kids. And all of a sudden they had this kind of dysregulated system. Organization was a struggle. Self-regulation was a struggle. And they kind of felt a little bit offline. And researchers like to call this the middle school cliff because, of course, the injury happened at 3, and then the crisis shows up at 13. And sometimes the really unfortunate part is a lot of these kiddos may get dislabeled. They could be called defiant, lazy. They might get diagnosed with ADHD, which may absolutely be accurate, but they may be missing the underlying cause. So the takeaway is if you know a child or a teen who's struggling and there was ever a head injury, even if it was years ago or if it seemed minor, that history matters. And for adults who had those childhood injuries, this might explain struggles that have followed you without anyone connecting the dots. So here's part 2 of mental traps that hinder care. There's just one more trap. This is it. I swear there are no more traps to review. So the experience trap sounds like this. I've seen this before. And this isn't so much a you trap. This is more so a community provider social support trap. And I admit I've absolutely fallen into that trap of I have this client who's presenting XYZ way. This really worked for them. So maybe this will work for that individual. And I can tell you that's not a way to set an individual up for success. The truth is, the last 10 people someone worked with tell them nothing about the next one. Because remember, the web of variability, every person is a unique combination of all those factors. So true expertise isn't knowing what to expect. It's knowing what you don't know and also remaining curious. So when we pattern match from past experience, we kind of miss the needs of the person actually in front of us. We might push strategies that worked before that maybe don't fit now. Or say I might use a strategy for an individual that doesn't work for another. Instead of what's wrong and how do I fix it, I really implore community support providers or loved ones to ask, who is this person? What are their specific barriers and what do they need right now? Which sounds like the standard for what a community support provider would do, but like I'd mentioned, it's not always the case. Sometimes we get caught up in our routine and our flow and, we kind of go into autopilot mode. So the goal is awareness, but also awareness for you to keep in mind that I'm disclosing. This is how, providers sometimes fall into that trap. So really advocate for yourself of, I understand that maybe this works for XYZ individual, but this isn't something that's going to work for me. So let's shift into what to do because it's not enough to know what to avoid. We need a new approach. So before strategies and before goals and before any interventions, start with curiosity. Traditional assessments are more reactive in a sense, as the focus tends to be on what the issue is. So What can I do? What's wrong? Why are you here today? What are you struggling with? How can we support you right now to kind of get you in and get you on your way and patch you up? Um, and we kind of create this demoralizing and incomplete picture. So the alternative is to uncover what works and ask the questions that reveal strengths. And you can even ask yourself this too, what works best for me? What are some of my interests or things that really bring me joy? You can ask, what's going well for you in a small way if you're speaking to a loved one? When do you feel the most like yourself? It could be, I feel the most like myself when I'm hiking or when I'm gaming or when I'm spending time with my dog or whatever that is for you. What are you proud of? And I cannot tell you how many times I've asked these questions and seen someone's whole demeanor change because people are often asked about their problems all the time, especially when you have a TBI and especially when you're seeing a provider. The main focus is, what the issue is, what the problem is, and being reactive to that. So no one exists in isolation. Sometimes more often than we realize, the environment is a primary barrier, and we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier. And we need to think about three types of environments. The physical environment, is it helping or hurting? Think about your noise levels, lighting and clutter. Is there access to rest when needed? Are you feeling sensory overload? They can absolutely make symptoms worse. Second is the social environment. Is it supportive? Is it stressful? Do you have friends? Do you have maybe a community that you can go to, like you're here today? Which again, I'm so happy that you're here. Are the people around you understanding? Is there conflict? Is there isolation? Third is the systemic environment. And for a lot of people, this is something that you can't really control, and especially if money is tight and you're unable to relocate to a place where maybe you have more access. So, what's creating those barriers to care? Is it transportation? Is it insurance, financial stress? Um, I worked with someone, we're going to call her Janet, and she was struggling terribly. And we were setting her up with all of these different kind of scenarios to help her get on her way. She was also deemed as non-compliant and difficult. And, looking back at all of the multidisciplinary team's case notes, I kind of created this persona, and you'll find a lot of community support individuals when we're reviewing these documents. Sometimes we do create this persona before even meeting you, like, oh, well, maybe she won't answer, or, maybe she won't follow through with their support. But really, just after speaking to Janet and finding out she was living with a roommate, it was noisy, it was loud. The roommate would blare the TV all the time. She was previously told to track her reminders in her phone, which she never used. So that didn't work for her. After asking, what are some things that you really like to do? I love to journal. And when she spoke about journaling, she would just light up. And I said, okay, well, maybe we can journal on some sticky notes and post those on your fridge and, give you those reminders. And that worked for her. And she was able to meet all of her appointments after that. So really, it's just a matter of finding what works best for you. And this is a slide primarily meant for support providers of strategies that I just touched on. A little bit about using different supports, not so much computer-based. Unless you're absolutely tech savvy, then I absolutely advocate for that. But sometimes tangible things seem to work best for memory. And here's some more principles for individual strategies. So how does this work? So we have 5 principles here. Person first, strategy second, and any strategy must fit the person's actual life and not the other way around. Like I mentioned previously, a beautiful intervention. I can come up with the most beautiful intervention for someone, but if it doesn't fit your life and if it doesn't fit you or your daily routine, it's going to stop. So advocate for yourself and really try to figure out, okay, this is what I'm struggling with. How can I really identify an intervention that works best for me to meet my need? You can collaborate. So collaborate, like I mentioned earlier, don't dictate. Ask What do you think might help? What have you already tried? Co-create solutions. And again, if you're kind of integrated into the community, this is something that you can advocate for yourself for. Starting small. I know a lot of people, and if you're anything like me, especially around the new year, I'll come up with these really grand kind of ideas of, oh man, for the next year, I want to hike. And this was something I was just speaking about with my husband. I want to hike all of the mountains and all of the locations, and I'm going to document it all. He's like, whoa, Katarina, like, let's start with some local hikes and you can work your way up. Let's be realistic. So, starting small, building momentum to your goals and what works best for you. And adjust, always adjust. You are not this constrained kind of document. Think about yourself as a living document. You're constantly working on yourself, reframing things, constantly learning, finding strategies that work best for you, and then leveraging your strengths, which I've spoke about in depth. So again, this is for community providers. You're absolutely a part of a larger team, but especially for anyone feeling overwhelmed. You don't have to solve anything alone. Just look at this diagram. That's you at the center, and you're surrounded by potential supports, medical providers, therapists, mental health professionals, case managers, community resources, employers, educators. And if you feel isolated, I know Reggie is probably the master at resource brokering. And, you being here is absolutely a step to kind of expanding that social circle that you have here. So each person in that circle plays a role. And it's key to knowing, who's involved in your community across those connections and identifying those gaps. And it matters so much because when your care is fragmented and your support is fragmented, the disconnected care leads to kind of less than ideal outcomes for you. So really integrate as much as you can. Find what works best for you. If you're not big on community support, that's okay. If this serves you best, that's okay too. Again, what works best for you may not work best for someone else. So for those living with a brain injury, really building your team, even gradually, matters. You don't have to do it alone, and asking for help is never a weakness. Sometimes really the most important thing anyone can do is not clinical intervention. It's just helping someone navigate a system. And I know the systems can be a beast. So really just making that connection, it's being the person who sees the whole person. So applying what we've learned, we've come to our time here. So I really want to make sure that this doesn't just stay as information, and I want it to become action. So I just want to ask you guys to reflect on these questions. So what assumptions did you hold, either for yourself or a loved one or someone that you're supporting, that you might need to challenge? And maybe it's an assumption about, yourself or a loved one. Which mental trap resonated most? And then what beliefs do you have, again, even if they're about yourself, that may need to be re-examined? And then second, what will you do differently after today? And I mean something specific, not, I'm going to be more patient with my spouse, or, something concrete like I'm going to ask what's going well, like what's going well for you today, before focusing on problems. Really just think about, how to have that strength-based lens for yourself or your loved one. I'm going to give myself 10 seconds before expecting a response, or I'm going to give myself that 10-second rule to do something that I really feel is impossible for me today. And certainly it's not about pushing through anything. If you're feeling exhausted and fatigued and you absolutely feel like, it's not for you today, then certainly, do take that time for yourself. But change doesn't happen when we're learning new information. It's going to happen when you take that information and you do something different. So just remember that thinking about your own thinking, I know that sounds so weird, but thinking about your own thinking is really just as important for those of us doing the supporting as it is for anyone managing brain changes. We all have blind spots and we all have room to grow. So I just want to leave you with this thought that, you're not a problem to be solved. And I know that coming to trainings and classes like this, and of course, talking about the problems and maybe, the barriers and how to resolve, it may feel, um, it may feel that way, like, oh gosh, like, I'm something to be solved. But, you know, you're the partner in the solution. And, this is life. This is life now. So it's really just about navigating life, as best as you can, and bringing your own wisdom and your own experience that no textbook can teach, and someone that I can't be up here preaching in a class. So, it's our job, whether we're professionals, family members, friends, or navigating your own brain injury. It's not to fix anyone, it's just to walk alongside, and just really to bring that knowledge into partnership with lived experience, and to stay curious when we're tempted to assume, and of course, to see the individual when it's easier to just see the diagnosis. So, with that, the individual reality demands individual care. And now we all have some new tools to provide and advocate for. So, thank you all so much for being with me here today. Now that we all have some new tools to provide and advocate for. And if anyone has any questions, I believe that Reggie will stop recording and you have the freedom to ask them.
Yes, I will stop recording. I'm just very grateful. I just want to say this before I stop recording for every single person that was here contributing, sharing this, like the positive energy. And thank you, Katerina, for this thorough and intentional like conversation. This is beautiful. Yay, it's so great. So I'm gonna stop the recording so people can share if they want.